I don't know about you, but when someone tells me they were raised in a Christian home or they were raised in church, I'm expecting the other shoe to drop. I'm expecting a but. I'm expecting there were so many rules. They were very religious. I didn't really have a relationship with God. I'm expecting that kind of experience to be the follow up to that statement. I'm expecting, in some cases, people to say they were spiritually abused, people to say they were mistreated as a result of religion being used as an excuse for some of the treatments that they had. Those are some of the things that I expect when people say they were raised in church or they were raised in Christian home. And even to make it worse, I'm expecting people to say their parents preached something, but they did not model what they were preaching at home, making their being raised in a Christian home a negative experience. Those are some of the things I've heard. And I'm sure you've heard all of these experiences before from your friends. Maybe you even have some of those stories to tell. I don't typically hear of I was raised in a Christian home or I was raised in church and it was the best experience of my life and it was a gift to me. I don't hear that often. And there's so many of us that were raised in Christian homes. And it makes me think that why do we have a lot of all of these experiences? Why does being raised in a Christian home have so much bad rap? Why do so many of us experience this growing up? On a much deeper level, it makes me think about why did God entrust innocent children in the hands of flawed parents? Why did God, knowing fully well that his creation, human beings, are flawed? He knows that. He knew that from the beginning. He knew that through the entire course of the Bible, in Genesis, where he asked man not to do this, and in the introducing into the world, and in the entire course of the Old Testament, God planning the redemption of man and man consistently failing at being redeemed. He knew that before the creation of the earth. So why did he think it was a good idea to say an innocent child that was born, which quite frankly, a child born is not really innocent because they are born in sin. But why did he think the child will have a chance at redemption if they were raised by flawed parents? That's the topic I want to explore into this conversation. And I'm hoping that this video helps you to rethink your experience if you were raised in a Christian home or if you were raised in church, so you don't necessarily always see it as a negative experience. This is also hopefully going to help you think deeply before you conclude that it was a flaw that you had to fix. I'm not saying that's not the case if you had to fix some things, but think deeply and think about it positively. I'm also hoping that this video helps those who were raised in Christian homes and for some reason have decided not to be with Christ anymore. I'm hoping that this video gives them one more reason to rethink this and give their hearts to God. I hope that God ministers through this to provide an opportunity for you to just open up your hearts to Him once again. I also want to put a disclaimer that this video does not condone or does not excuse or does not encourage spiritual abuse. It also does not diminish the experiences and the feelings of the people that have actually gone through spiritual abuse or have been maltreated all in the name of religion, because we know it, spiritual leaders sometimes use some of these religious reasons as an excuse for maltreating people. And even worse, it does not negate the experiences of people that were raised in cults disguised as churches or cults disguised as family. This does not negate their experiences. And if you've been in any of those situations, I pray that you receive the healing that you need, you receive the restoration that you need, and you just come to know Christ for who He is, God for the Father that He is, not based on the experiences that you had in the real world. That's what I'm hoping this video does. But let's get into it. Because I was in a religious gathering a few weeks ago, and the question that they asked was, who are the people that have had the most impact on your spiritual journey? I already put down the names of some of the religious teachers, theologians, the Tim Mackeys, the Tim Kellers, those people that I follow their teachings now, that I made a choice to listen to, and they help me with my spiritual growth. Those are the people that I put down as people that have had the most impact on my spiritual journey. And for a second, the Holy Spirit convicted me and said, why is it the people that you follow now, the people that we made an intentional choice to listen to now, that have impacted your spiritual journey? Quite frankly, these people don't know you personally. And it was just like, yeah, you listen to them, you follow their teachings, but one, they I don't think they've had the most direct impact on you, because they don't even know who you are. So you're being impacted by people that you're following on the media that have no personal relationship with you. Is there nobody in your life who you have a personal relationship with that you say would have had the most significant impact on you? And then I started going through my mind, like, who are people that I know personally that have had the most impact on you? Then I thought about my family, and the first set of people that I thought about my parents. And I was like, yeah, no, not really. And it was like, why not? Why not your parents? And I had to think about it for a second, that there has to be something here. If I don't have people within my direct relationship that we have a close known relationship together that have impacted me spiritually, then what is going on? And I thought about my parents, and I was like, yeah, my parents, because I was raised in a Christian home, I was raised in church. And the Holy Spirit told me that, why is that not good enough? Why is it not good enough that they raised me in church? Why is that not significant enough? Why is that not impactful enough? And that's because as humans, we're always looking out for experiences that make us feel good to consider them significant or impactful. We're always looking at things that tug at our hearts in a significant way. Like all the teachings I listen to, like all the preaching and all the powerful messages that I'm like, yes, because I made a choice to follow those leaders, which are great, by the way. And those are the things that we consider impactful. But we don't think about the subconscious, the experiential things that we have and how they may have made an impact in our lives, even if we didn't make those choices directly, even if we didn't intentionally choose to be in some communities, even if we didn't intentionally choose to be in a family, even if we didn't intentionally choose to be raised at five in a church, we think that the lessons and the things that were imbibed in us, even though they were not things that we enjoyed at that time, we think that those things are not significant enough. I was raised in a Christian home. I was raised in a home where we had morning devotion every day at 5 or 6 a.m. My dad is probably knocking on the window of my sister and I's room till this day. And I know the sound of his knock. And it's like, oh my God, daddy is waking us up for morning devotion again this morning. And we sit in the same living room, and myself and my siblings have like the visual cues we give to each other that tells us this is going to be a long devotion, or oh my God, mommy is leading devotion today, or I'm feeling sleepy. We have those visual cues that we all understood because we did those every day for years. Why was that not good enough to consider as a significant impact in my life? And I say this, and it may sound to some people like, well, that was a good experience for you. I don't think I considered my parents perfect growing up. Till date, I don't even consider them perfect. And sometimes we have some very deep conversations where I unearth their flaws, irrespective of how I think they raised me. I didn't even think that was good enough until I had that reflection. So don't think I'm considering my parents perfect in this scenario. I'm just expressing that this was a lot of experiences that many of us had if we think about it deeply. Our parents forced us to church. Our parents forced us to sit through those Bible studies, forced us to sit through those prayer meetings. Some of us, our parents considered taking us to church as a form of punishment because they knew we did not enjoy it. And that was the upbringing that I had. Our parents knew that we hated those morning devotions. Our parents would knock us on our heads physically if we dozed off during those morning devotions. Our parents would decide that yes, we're fasting today, partly because there was no food at home. And those are the experiences that we had. And we hated those experiences growing up. But I think to myself, why was that not good enough? And do I think that the subconscious learning that I had from those harsh mechanisms by which my parents or the church I grew up in delivered Christianity to me, do I think that those harsh mechanisms and the delivery, do I think that I didn't gain anything positive out of those experiences, even though I didn't enjoy it then? Even if I'm not going to do some of those things to my kids now, do I not understand what they were trying to do and how that has formed who I am today? Would I have had it done otherwise? Those are the questions I ask myself after I had that reflection in that moment about who I consider the most significant impact in my spiritual journey. Thinking about how God entrusts innocent children in the hands of flawed people. He said it to the Israelites in Deuteronomy 6 from verse 4 to 6, which I'll read. When the children of Israel got out of Egypt and he delivered them and he was giving them the laws. Fun fact, I discovered that Deuteronomy means second law, like deuter, second. Ronomy is law, fun fact. And he said in book of Deuteronomy chapter 6 verse 4 to 7, and he reads, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your might. And these words that I have commanded you today shall be on your hearts. You shall teach them diligently to your children, and shall talk to them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, when you rise. God is telling the Israelites, like, look, I am the Lord your God, I am one. You shall love me with all your heart and your soul and your mind, and you shall teach it to your children. And I think, like, why did God think that this was a good idea? That these people were capable to teach their children. And guess what? The failures of our parents and our religious leaders did not start in our generation. Even if God gave them this law in Deuteronomy saying you shall teach your children and their children and this and that, and you put it at the fore of your face and all of this. The entire Old Testament is about these people consistently not doing that, consistently going against the law of God, consistently not teaching their children, consistently being rebellious, not even putting God at the front and center. So this experience of, oh, I was raised in church, but my parents did not even like reflect what Christ was. There were so many rules, they were strict, they were sheltered. It didn't start in our generation. It's probably not going to end in our generation. So God knew, but God still feels like that is the best course of action for mankind. The reasons why I believe that God knew, but he feels that it's still part of the redemption plan to put innocent children in the hands of flawed parents in the flawed society is because, one, being raised in a Christian home, I could have been somewhere else. If my parents considered taking me to church as punishment or a form of discipline, I'm glad that that was what they considered discipline enough. Because some other people had other options of discipline, which was much worse than being taken to church. Again, this does not negate the fact that some people were taken to church and they were also abused in church. That also happens. But for a lot of us that this was not our experience, we just hated it because it was strict, it was sheltered, we feel it was out of touch. I think that that's a much palatable punishment than the alternatives that exist out there. And if you talk to a lot of your friends that were not even raised in church, the things that were done to them as a form of discipline to them, you'll be glad you were taken to church for discipline and for punishment. So for that, I could have been somewhere else, but my parents considered taking me to church as an option. Even if it meant your parents wanted you out of their space, like just go to this church camp so I can have this weekend to myself. I'm glad that they considered sending me to church camp, even if it meant that they didn't want to spend that time with me. I'm glad that that was an option because it could have been much worse. The second reason is also people associate being raised in church with the rules and the regulations and the Ten Commandments and the out of touch nature of church as a whole. In any organized society, there are rules and regulations, even in school. Let's talk about rules and regulations because that's a lot of us struggle with having those rules, being told what to do without an explanation or an understanding of a reason why we should not do some of those things. There are rules everywhere. At work, at school, even as adults, we live in a society that is bound by rules and regulations and laws. So why is the church an exception? The religious leaders in the church structured the church in the way that they knew how to, in the way that they understood the Bible. Was it perfect? Absolutely not. Was it necessary? Absolutely. And a lot of us think about some of those rules as confining. And I think about it as it was the same rules that God gave the Israelites. Have you gone through the book of Exodus? Have you gone through the book of Deuteronomy? Have you gone through the book of Numbers? Have you seen the laws that God gave? And it's still a point of struggle of several people today about those laws. But I see them as a way of organizing us, as structure. And if I ultimately believe that God is good, I believe that his laws are perfect, his laws are good. Now, do humans execute the rules and the laws and the boundaries of God perfectly? Absolutely not. And those are not excuses. But if you think about any organized society having rules, then it makes sense why the church will have those strict rules. And if you think about the reason why the church was set up, honestly, you will understand why the rules of the church were a bit more stringent than any other group. So this does not negate abuse once again. It does not negate cults being disguised as church or religious organization or family. It does not negate parents abusing their children as a result, but it makes you understand the reason why some of those churches that were raised in had those rules and felt like they were very strict. The other thing I consider with respect to a positive when it comes to being raised in a Christian home or being raised in churches, because our parents are flawed, but that does not reflect poorly on God. That does not reflect poorly on our Creator who entrusted us into their hands. Could my parents have modeled church better in how they raised me? Absolutely. But the thing is, God entrusting me in the hands of my parents was also part of their sanctification journey. God saying, Mr. X and Mrs. Y, I need you to raise this child right. It was part of their own journey as well. It was not just about me, it was also part of their journey into learning, into growing, into becoming more like Christ. So I was part of their own sanctification journey as well. And understanding that they are flawed people who were also hoping to be sanctified through the life experiences, through raising children, through being who they were, makes me also have more grace for their experiences. Again, not negating the impact on me, it just makes me realize that God uses flawed humans irrespective. And it does not mean that my life will not be saved, or it does not mean that it will negatively impact me ultimately. It means that God will work it around and work back how to get me towards Himself, irrespective of how their flaws may have impacted me. And on that is also realizing that even if my parents did not model Christ the way that I think they should have, ultimately my salvation is not up to them. I'm not going to outsource my salvation to my parents. And sometimes we say all of this as if, oh, if my parents portrayed Christ well, if my parents portrayed Christianity well, if they practiced what they preached, then maybe I would have been much better for it. Maybe I would have been saved earlier. Maybe I've had a different perception of Christianity. But that statement sounds like you're outsourcing your salvation to your parents. Your salvation is up to you and God. God is ultimately responsible for our salvation. It's not our parents, it's not our friends, it's not the community that we live in. Yeah, absolutely, those things could contribute. But ultimately, God is responsible for our salvation. And it's a decision that we have to consciously make with God. So, using the flaws of our parents and the disconnect we see when we think about being raised in church and what our parents portrayed, and using that as a reason why we may have not been saved early, or we have this version of Christianity that we're struggling with today. Sometimes I think it's a cop out. It's a cop out for us not to take accountability for our salvation. And it is a way to explain why we are who we are. But if we think about the fact that irrespective of all of those things, God is ultimately going to redeem me to Himself, and He will help me find my way back to Him, then it makes all of those things less relevant in the grand scheme of things. It makes all of those things insignificant. It makes all the experiences that you have as you go through just part of the journey to ultimately being redeemed to Christ. If your salvation is God's work and yours, it will bring everything to remembrance that He taught you, which is the other angle of sometimes we think about being raised in church as just rules, but some of those subconscious teachings come to play when it matters. And I believe that that is ultimately what God is trying to do by entrusting us in the hands of flawed parents who are just trying their best. Like all these Bible stories that were taught at Sunday school. I read some of those stories now and I'm like, this is not exactly how I was told the story growing up. A lot of those teachings, they are embedded in our subconscious at the point where it was necessary for God to revisit them in our lives. They were already there. It didn't matter how they got in there. And I want to read a Bible verse for us because in John 14:26, when Jesus was living, He was telling the disciples that the Helper, the Holy Spirit, whom the Father will send in my name, He will teach you all things and bring to your remembrance all that I have said to you. When you think about the experience of Jesus with His disciples, He had only 3 years of ministry. And within those 3 years, He taught them so many things. I'm sure some of them, they probably didn't get half of what the guy was trying to teach them. Because even when He was leaving, they were still panicking like, oh, where are you going to? How are we going to survive? And it's like, guys, don't worry. If I don't leave, the helper won't come. And if the helper comes, it's going to help you remember everything I taught you. So 3 years was not even sufficient enough time for Jesus to pass on His teachings to the first set of Christians. And I think about it the same way that our parents having us in church for whatever reason, and we getting some of those teachings and those experiences, even though we didn't understand them at that point, they were just things that were necessary to get into us somehow. Oh, force you to read your Bible, force you to have those spiritual disciplines of praying, force you to wake up every day at 6 a.m. to pray. Those things were necessary to get into us at some point in time, somehow, so that at the point where God is going to need those things for our salvation and for our redemption, they're already there. They just come out. I've heard accounts of many people that got saved without anybody preaching to them. I heard a story last week of Philip Anthony Michel. He had a very lost life. He had an auntie who always sent him to church to punish him. And he had several encounters, direct encounters, where nobody was directly involved. He was just having revelations of God calling him to himself before God eventually called him to it himself.
My parents they're from Trinidad, so they had a kind of an expression of Christianity that was very foreign to me. So it wasn't like American.
Oh, okay.
In a sense. You know what I'm saying? It was more island expression. So I never heard gospel music.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
And she puts on gospel music. She's lifting her hands and she's walking back and forth in her bedroom, lifting her hands, and she's praising God that she doesn't get injured in this accident. Now, at the time, she doesn't know I'm suicidal, but I'm empty, right? And I'm looking at her praising God, bro, and I'm watching her, and I'm thinking to myself, whatever that is, I want that for myself. And I remember I crawl into the bathroom on my hands and knees. I close the door. I started yelling at God, if you exist, you meet me right here. If you exist, you speak to my heart. And I'm yelling at God, not knowing he really existed. I'm just thinking he's just a name in a book that my parents read. And the Lord reveals himself to me in that bathroom. I could feel his presence in that bathroom. I know something happened to me in that bathroom. I know that was the moment I was converted to Christianity. That was the moment I passed from death to life. That was the moment I knew something changed, because I went out that bathroom that day, tried to have sex with my wife that night, and was the very first time I felt convicted of sin. It was like, oh snap, this doesn't feel right.
I also had a similar account with Jackie Hill Perry. She also was raised in church, but she became a stud, and she was saved in her room without anybody being there.
October 2008, I'm 19, and I'm in my bed. I wasn't at a church. I wasn't at a conference. There was no altar. Once again, I wasn't going to church. And I was in my bed. I was probably watching Making the Band or something really irrelevant. And I felt God speak to my heart and say that the girl that I was with would be the death of me. It was deep because I felt as if he wasn't just saying that lesbianism would be the death of me, but that my life would be the death of me.
I also had an account of, I believe, maybe Preston Perry, who also had an aunt that was always praying for him, and he sold drugs and things like that. But he eventually came to Christ by himself.
Pastors, and I was like, I got to go to this church or whatever. But God set me up, From there, I believe the Lord began to pursue me. And when a couple of years later, a friend of mine got shot and killed, and I felt like the Lord was like, man, this is you and your sin. You're dead and you're saying you don't know me. From there, I got introduced to a guy named Gary Brown, who ended up leading me to Jesus. And man, like, my life changed. Jesus met me one day in my room. I had a real encounter with the Lord. I remember crying out to God and just asking him to forgive me for all the sins that I committed, because the weight of my sin became so heavy on me.
Yeah.
And I started to think about all the things that I did in my life that deserved death. And I just began to cry, and I began to feel like this weight, and it felt like the Lord was like putting all the weight or like on me, and it became unbearable in my room. And I remember not really knowing what repentance looked like, or even sounding like I didn't know the sinner's prayer. I didn't have biblical language. I just said, God, I want to love you like Gary loves you. Save me. And I just remember this weight coming off of me and me feeling new. And the Lord saved me that day in this room. And
so somehow some of the things that their moms, their aunts, their parents, their religious leaders mentioned to them when they were growing up, when they were just in church, because church is what people do. Those things eventually come to play when it's necessary. And that, I believe, is one of the genius of the mechanisms of God, that it will make you have encounters and experiences that you consider insignificant, like I did, that you consider yeah, I'm just going to church because I don't like it, my parents force me. But at the point where salvation will truly come to you, you will remember those teachings. You understand why you needed those disciplines. You will even understand and remember some of the rules that the church set. And you are now in a better position to question and ask, oh, why were we asked to do this? Why was this rule in place? And you're in a much better situation now to realign and readjust your motive and your rationale around why you have some of those rules and regulations in church without necessarily thinking they were wrong. That's one of the things that God ensures that we have. It's part of his sovereignty to make sure that provision is already made even before you thought you needed it. Looking into the future, there's a lot of young people that have decided not to go to church anymore. The truth is, people are not going to church like they used to. It doesn't diminish the power of the foundation that we have been given. It just means that the devil is hard at work. And you have a lot more people now being boldly non-Christian, which I totally understand. You have a lot of people that were even raised in church and then they're like, nope, I'm not doing that anymore. And I pray that a lot of all those people experience how deep the love of Christ truly is. And this is not even about being Christian by title or saying I'm going to church. It's more about what it really means to be a disciple of Christ, to become like Christ, to walk with Christ, to be with Him. And I'll read a Bible verse that I hope ministers to them, because the love that God has for us and the providence and the sovereignty that He has over our lives to make all these things available for us is beyond what any human experience can describe, and is beyond what any human mistake can undo. The fact that church wronged you, the fact that you consider your church or religious upbringing as a mistake, is insignificant in the grand scheme of the love that Christ has for you. And the Bible verse I'm going to read to that effect is in Ephesians chapter 3, verse 14 to 19. By the way, I love Ephesians so much because sometimes when I'm reading Ephesians, it feels like my brain wants to burst. Paul writes a whole sentence in like a chapter. Like a chapter is like a sentence. You're looking for the full stop, and you're like, bro, did you just spill this entire book out of your heart without a stop? That's one of the reasons why Ephesians is like a very interesting Bible book. But Ephesians chapter 3, verse 14 to 19 says, for this reason I bow my knees before the Father, from whom every family in heaven and on earth is named, that according to the riches of his glory, he may grant you to be strengthened with power through his Spirit in your inner being, so that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith, that you, being rooted and grounded in love, you may have the strength to comprehend with all the saints what is the breadth, and what is the length, and what is the height and depth, and to know the love of Christ that surpasses knowledge, that you be filled with all the fullness of God. So this verse basically says, look, all of these activities that you guys are doing, yeah, all nice and good. But what I really pray is that you have an encounter that would help you understand how deep, how wide, how much the love of Christ is for you, that surpasses anything that you think you know. And that is my prayer for people that have decided that Christianity is no longer for them. I want to encourage you to realize that the love that Christ has for you is far beyond the flaws of your religious leaders. I want you to understand that the impact of the mistake that your parents made as they were raising you as Christian, or the impact of the mistake of some religious leaders over your life, all in the name of religion, or the impact of any abuse or harm that you may have encountered that were religious in nature. I pray that you realize that the impact of those things are insignificant compared to the love that Christ has for you. That the love that Christ has for you can undo all of those things in a second if you allow it. And you may ask, like, oh yeah, if that's the case, then why has he not undone the mistakes and everything? I pray that God will help you to open up your heart to Him, for you to realize how much He loves you, to undo some of those mistakes. And for those of us that are young now I'm beginning to reorient ourselves back into being a follower of Christ and unlearning some of the things that we thought were not necessarily well done or well established in our lives. I say you should continue. And I pray that we also understand and give grace to those religious leaders, that we realize that the transformation that we need does not come from the experiences that we have. The transformation that we need will come irrespective of those experiences, that we'll have more grace for those people, that we also understand why they did what they did, and we consider that we were raised in church as significant enough, even though it didn't feel like it in the moment. And I want to charge us that as we're going to raise the next generation of Christians, people are having kids now, and people have the option of raising their children differently. I want to charge us that we intentionally and consciously raise our children in the right way that God enables us to. That as time goes on, we begin to see situations where people talk about being raised in church or being raised in Christian homes in a more positive light, that it becomes a testimony. I want to charge you that you think about the possibility that when your children are in their 20s or in their 30s, they have a testimony that says, I was raised in a Christian home, and that's the best gift anyone has ever given to me. Or I was raised in church, and that's changed my life for the better. I want to charge you that you should raise your children in a way that is their testimony. May God help us.